Many organizations remain worried that the COVID-19 vaccine rollout will be hampered by procurement fraud and corruption. Now, public trust in government's ability to ensure a fair and corrupt-free exercise has been addressed by both President Cyril Ramaphosa and Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize. Now, Worldwide Industrial and Systems Engineers is a local company that provides support for international standards. The company believes that the rollout could be successfully done without corruption if we follow international standards that involve proper checks and balances. Let's unpack it all for you. We're joined now by the firm's managing director, Mohammed Ali. Mohammed, it's great to have you with us here on the AM Report on Newzroom Channel 405 this morning. I mean, it is the biggest threat, certainly the biggest perceived threat to our vaccine rollout plan, the possibility of corruption.
100%. Thank you very much, Michelle, and good morning to South Africa. I think everyone needs to understand that, the ISO standards have been there from the early 1940s. And effective implementation is, I think, where the public sector has fallen short. And I think once these international standards are implemented effectively, where the different ownership and responsibility and accountability of their processes are taken into account, there will be success and there should be light at the end of the tunnel, as many other public sectors around the world have followed these standards and case studies to prove that there's actually work.
Yeah, the ISO standards you talk about, it's International Organization for Standards. And when we think about how perhaps we've fallen short in the very, very recent past, we can look at the PPE scandal where, in fact, many companies were found to not have accreditation in terms of these international standards.
Correct, 100%. So when the procurement phase comes in, I think that's perhaps maybe where we've fallen short a little bit. You've got the PFMA, the Public Financial Management Act, and there's a standard called ISO 20400. That's what the public sector need to implement. It's the sustainable procurement. When the tender goes out and you go through phase one or part A of the tender, when you're reviewing legal documentation, it's easy to have a letter of good standing, a BE certificate and a tax clearance certificate. But do the companies actually have an ISO certificate? Are they ISO 13485, according to what the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, SAPRA, are saying that you should have? Because if these organizations did have this, they would not be substandard PPE and they would have followed the effective process. Also, an independent body evaluating the tender process to verify and validate that these particular vendors have the necessary requirements in order to be able to produce or are within the vendor list to be able to produce this, the PPE. And I think there were a lot of shortcuts taken and concessions that were made without the right due diligence process followed. And ISO standards and the certification and independent audits could have avoided this.
Yeah. Mohammed, it sounds like what you're saying is that there is no requirement for companies to have these ISO standards when applying for a tender with government.
100%. I think the government hasn't enforced this as much. And this is where I think we're falling short. A lot of organizations now feel that if they can be able to fit in within the 80-20 or 90-10 principles with regards to their pricing, they will be able to be awarded the tender. There is a relevance that's required to be able to validate that these companies are able to provide appropriate products and services. And it's just a check sheet. Nowadays, you can go online and download an ISO certificate. Whether or not that is accredited, whether or not there's a due diligence done on the company prior to them being awarded the tender is where we are falling short, and the standard requires you to do that. And that is where the problem is. I mean, if you look at the private sector, they're very adamant to ensure that when they procure services from a vendor, that they will receive the respective products and services. And the ISO certificate is a level of assurance. In the public sector, not so much. And I think not only does the public sector need to be able to ask their vendors, but I think they also need to start looking at implementing these standards to give the public of South Africa the level of assurance, especially when it comes to anti-bribery. There is a standard called ISO 37001. And yes, there's a lot of departments in the public sector that want to be able to prove that they are meeting these standards. But are they really? Is there some sort of justification, assurance, certification being done? And are we effectively implementing these standards? These are unfortunately the question marks that have surfaced up during the entire COVID-19 pandemic, let alone be PPE as well as the COVID-19 vaccine rollout.
So let's talk about the ISO 17025. That's the certificate that's needed in terms of the testing of vaccines. Now, according to the information that I have, not many labs on the continent actually have these controls in place. How do we score in South Africa?
I think in South Africa, one thing needs to be granted is the South African National Accreditation System, noted as SANAS, is generally the organization that accredits laboratories. And there are no shortcuts taken when actually evaluating against the ISO standard. So laboratories around the country, especially in South Africa, it's not an easy standard to adopt or to be able to be accredited to. We also have very specialized and skilled auditors that go into the laboratory and make sure from a physical security, humidity, temperature, and the respective controls to justify we're following international standards in place. In Africa, if you look at it as a whole, there's very few that have the ISO 17025 accreditation. In South Africa, we have quite a few. And I think that gives you a level of confidence and assurance that now that the vaccines have been put in place, that the accredited laboratories are giving you some sort of confidence that the particular checks and balances will be done before it's rolled out to the public. And 17025 is the accreditation that's required by laboratories to be able to prove to the public and give a level of assurance that they're not taking any shortcuts, as they will be independently audited by SANAS with skilled auditors.
Right. So this is the question that arises when it comes to vaccine hesitancy in our country and around the world. People are afraid of taking the vaccine. There is, to a certain degree, a level of a trust deficit. Now, regarding the vaccines that have been approved for use in South Africa, government now saying the delivery took place yesterday. Over the next 10 to 14 days, there'll be various processes, including evaluating the standards of the vaccines. What happens if it is found that we've been provided, and we all hope and pray that's not the case, but if it is found we've been provided with a substandard vaccine?
I think that's a very important question, Michelle. I think the key thing is, what responsibility and accountability have we got with the suppliers providing us with these vaccines? I do know internally in South Africa, as Minister has mentioned, that we will have a level of identification and traceability from a barcoding perspective to be able to understand which vaccines are coming from which organization. However, if, for example, there are significant side effects that they could have avoided by doing the necessary checks and balances, are we able to hold them responsible and accountable? And I think that is the question that a lot of people have, is the insecurity behind if something goes wrong. Yes, it could. There is a small percentage that it could. But whether or not we can be able to hold these laboratories and these countries responsible and accountable, and what exactly are those terms? We need to be communicated to understand those particular terms. And the ISO standards govern the particular requirements of how this should be facilitated. But more importantly, how it should be communicated. And I think that is where the level of insecurity and inassurance is coming out. The public sector have done well. Our hats off to President Cyril Ramaphosa on a very difficult situation to be able to communicate as well as he did and be able to create a level of assurance. But there's still a level of transparency that's required. South Africans as a nation, a little bit insecure with what happened with the PPE and all the funding that was there. So it's about being able to communicate well and being able to send the reports on a platform that we can read and be able to interpret and understand well. But the question remains, can we hold these responsible and accountable? And if we do they lose the accreditation? What financial liabilities will they face? Will there be any legal liabilities that will be able to face? And for the person that's actually taking the vaccine and maybe suffers the side effects, what exactly is the process for them to follow to be able to hold these organizations accountable?
Mohammed, you talked about the ISO 37001. That's the standard that's used to tackle bribery and corruption. I mean, all of these different standards you've talked to us about this morning become all the more important as we now look towards one of the biggest and probably one of the most important projects we're undertaking as a country, vaccinating 40 million people by the end of 2021. But it also gives us the answer to tackling corruption in broader South Africa as we look to rebuild our economy post the pandemic, the level of trust that is now needed for international companies to come to South Africa and to invest so that we can start to look post the pandemic.
100%. If you look at Germany as an example, after World War II, they were in shatters. And unfortunately, they needed to rebuild. And they needed to implement good governance and international standards. Now, if you look at it, a secretary that writes a letter takes their pride with regards to responsibility and accountability in typing a letter to make sure the necessary quality checks and balances are done, whether or not it's the font, whether or not it's the CI manual, whether it's the margins. And it's the pride that's been taken into account and it's embedded in their culture. We in South Africa need to get to that point. I agree, we are a building nation and we need to be able to understand exactly what has gone wrong and acknowledge it. We need to effectively implement this. Gone are the days of just having policies and procedures that are nice and fancy from a quantity point of view, where they are not effectively implemented and not embedded in the organization's culture. ISO 37001, anti-bribery, a lot of foreign investors are asking the questions to the organizations in South Africa they want to invest in, because unfortunately, according to transparencyinternational.com, we are labeled as a corrupt country. That is not a good title to have. So they have the necessary due diligence where they want to affirm that whether or not we have controls in place to avoid anti-bribery so that they can be able to invest in us. We need to start in the public sector to implement these standards and educate the people to be responsible and accountable, as well as have due diligence process and checks and balances independently done. The question we have is, how are we going to implement these management systems? And that is where we need to use innovative ways. People are not going to read these 50-page policies. We need to create innovative ways of videos to get people to understand what the policies mean, be able to interpret the definitions of what Auditor General are raising as findings to them and reoccurring findings. We're not implementing thorough root cause analysis with corrective actions to be able to prevent the reoccurrence of these findings. And we're not using the risk management system effectively. Once we start doing that as a nation and start understanding that we need to embed this as a cultural change, we will then move forward.
Yeah, it's the answer to the problem of corruption that we have, the scourge of corruption that we have in our country. Mohammed, thanks very much for your time this morning. An incredibly enlightening conversation. Mohammed Ali is MD of Worldwide Industrial Systems Engineers. Government being urged to implement these international standards, especially now, to ensure a corrupt-free vaccine rollout.